So just to kind of round things up for the 21st century, I think that this is a point, if more people were willing to acknowledge it, and many discussions we see going on around us, it would just cut through a lot of confusion and I think get people at least not to necessarily agree with each other, but to understand better what the basis of their disagreements are, more easily. And then it would just be kind of easier to say, maybe we can find some common ground, or maybe, there's not resolvable differences that we can work out with sort of argument or philosophizing together. So like, what are a few examples of that? Well, we have going on in Israel right now, a big debate in society about what should be done with the Supreme Court, and whether there are changes that should be made to the procedures that the court has to follow in terms of what laws it can strike down or how it selects its members, etc. And the rhetoric that you hear, and even I would say like on both sides of the argument, if we're going to represent what's commonly stated, so if you ask, I don't know, leaders on either side of the argument, in the political sphere or in the media or whatever, you have on the one hand people saying, if we limit the court's power relative to what it is now, that will be the end of Israeli democracy. That will be the beginning of a dictatorship, and it will prevent the defense and protection of the rights of Israeli citizens, which is currently being successfully carried out by the court with its current powers. So that you hear that on one side, and that way of looking at things certainly motivates a number of people to protest the proposed changes. And then you hear people on the other side saying, no, it's actually more democratic to let voters select representatives and let those representatives be the ones to decide who sits on the Supreme Court. And so then you have more democratic accountability to voters built into who's operating on the who's participating in decisions in the court. And that's not a dictatorship. That's a greater democracy, or a more democratic system. And I think that one of the things that just leads to a lot of confusion in this argument, in this back and forth, is that there's very little ability on either side to engage in a discussion, first of all, of what they mean by democracy when they're using whatever reference to this is democracy or this isn't, or also how they know that thing that they define as democracy is a thing to be valued, and that should be our goal. Because you have people who are basically saying a democracy is defined by the outcomes it generates that prove that the rights of certain kinds of groups are being protected by some kind of separation of power situation, and that's what we should call democracy, and everything else we should call a dictatorship. And then we're supposed to say it's bad if it becomes what we call a dictatorship. Or you have people who say that, well, democracy is about the voting of groups of people and counting up the majority, and giving the choice of what the outcome should be to the people who are the most numerous. And again, the idea is, oh, and that must be better. If it's more democratic, of course it must be better. And both sides of that argument are kind of in one way or another trying to ignore some underlying question, which is, why do we think democracy is good, and where do we get that from? Who gets to decide what the definition of democracy is? And everyone is kind of in flight from that, because I think this maybe is another way into this example, or this point would have been just to say, in a world where people don't acknowledge the relationship between language and ideology, what ends up happening is they still try to make use of the fact that relationship exists, but they do it in a way that either is about deceiving themselves or others, or both. Because the truth is that if you control the language for how something gets talked about, you of course can use that to manipulate people's motivations. Like you end up being able to say, you can get mobs of people to be in favor of something or against something, depending on whether you call it more democracy or whether you call it more dictatorship, right? And so we're talking about the same changes, and you have people struggling over who gets to control how this is characterized, because what everyone actually all knows is that they're dealing with a populace that essentially has enough of an idolatrous relationship to the notion of something called democracy, that if they can convince everyone that this is the end of democracy, or convince everyone that this is more democracy, then they win the argument. And so you have, when people are not clear-eyed about where they're planting their feet, about the need actually for them to understand that like their fundamental vocabulary for characterizing a situation is inseparable from the value judgments that they're going to be making, that when they lose sight of that, you can sort of try to like figure out where people have ended up making their commitments. What are the idols that they don't necessarily even acknowledge for themselves? What are the buzzwords or the sort of magical phrases that they feel they have to respond to if the argument is put to them a certain way? And then it becomes this game or this tug of war of like, who can control the definition of certain terms? Like, we all agree, of course, democracy is great and we have to have democracy. And so now it just becomes this argument of like, who can most rapidly take over the right to define what democracy is, and then maybe you win the argument that way. And so and I think people are susceptible to this, again, because they're not coming into the situation as, I would argue, maybe you'd like someone to come in as an Oved Hashem, where they would say instead, okay, I don't see the word democracy anywhere in the Torah. That might mean, nonetheless, that sometimes democracy could be a great thing. It could be a Kiddush Hashem in certain circumstances. It could also maybe be a terrible thing. It could be a Chilul Hashem in some other circumstances. I am interested to know, first of all, how to characterize the world in the language of the Torah, and that's where my value judgments come from, and that's where my commitments come from. And then I'll look at this and I'll just say, okay, so I can break this down, and I'm not only concerned with what is more or less democratic, and I don't really care how we define democracy, because it's not going to make me be more or less in favor of something just because someone has quantified the amount of democracy in something and said whether it's right or not. And then you can start to make your decision based on criteria that are not as easy for someone to constantly be sort of gerrymandering or tinkering with or changing the definition of, because these things get nailed down in stuff that it's a lot harder to tamper with, because it's linked to, if we're talking about using the Torah as the foundation, it's linked to a lot of halakha, it's linked to a lot of practical rules for how to act that require a lot of stable vocabulary that are not really constantly subject to redefinition and manipulation. So that applies, in the current circumstance where you have this senseless debate raging about who is being more in favor of democracy, when in fact, whether you're in favor of democracy or not may not really be a totalizing value judgment that always determines whether you're doing the right thing or not anyway. And to say otherwise is basically to engage in a form of idolatry. But it really applies across the board. You can do the same kind of analysis on a lot of other things. Again, related to the whole debate with the court, there's this discussion of people's rights and like the need to have the court defend everyone's rights. Well, there's a lot of empirical evidence that the court in its current form has not actually always defended people's rights. It defends, or let's say it protects the interests of some groups in instances that align with its goals. And when it does that, you can call that protecting the rights of the people that it benefited. There are other instances where It ignored what you would call the rights of people that it chose not to benefit. But in any case, the whole language, the whole framework for talking about rights of people, again, is something that is absent from the language of the Torah. And I think the key thing here is, like, the same way I was saying, with biology and physics, like, it's you can talk about a living cell and you can say, oh, how much does it weigh, or how wide is it, or what is the voltage across its membrane, or whatever. You can make physical measurements, or you can ask biological questions and say, oh, how uh, uh, successfully did this cell undergo division, and was there proper separation of all of its chromosomes, or what have you. And you can make these different kinds of characterizations. You're talking about the same thing, but you're doing it in different languages. And I think similarly, that to say that the Torah does not contain the idea of human rights as an explicit form of vocabulary, that's not to say that it doesn't contain ideas that at some level map onto that. Clearly, at some level, the whole notion of human rights comes from the bequest of valuing human beings as being made in the image of God, that came from the Judaic message that was then promulgated and propagated throughout the world through different sort of devolutions of it into other ideologies. So one wouldn't want to say that there's nothing in the Torah that aligns with the idea that there's such a thing as human rights. And yet, again, no word in the Torah for human rights, but not because the Torah is somehow not up to speed, or not, with it, and not as advanced as what people have come up with in preceding or current centuries, but rather because that's kind of a different way of talking about things that attempts to characterize how people should be dealing with each other in other terms. And the reason that that's important is because what that's going to mean is that sometimes the Torah is going to seem like it's very much in favor of what we call human rights, and other times it's going to disagree with people who say that they're concerned with things called human rights. And if your fundamental commitment is to try to analyze the world in terms and in vocabulary and in terms of value judgments that are rooted in Torah, then you can navigate that discussion with agility, and you can say, well, okay, in this case, yeah, I totally agree, and I'm very much in favor of this thing that you would say, people who are advocates for human rights, would push for. But in another instance, you would come along and say, like, okay, you're saying to me that there's a problem here because what the Torah is saying, it's against human rights. Well, but maybe that's not so much the issue, from the perspective of someone who's making their value judgments coming from another system. And again, it's not, because the Torah can't comprehend such a concept, but rather because it's capable of having nuance in how it treats the subject, because it isn't nailed down to or committed to an overly simplistic vocabulary that makes an idol out of a simpler set of concepts. So I think what it comes down to fundamentally is that we will much more successfully navigate complicated conversations about what people should do together, and what choices they should make, if we understand that you can't cede the right to determine the vocabulary for characterizing what the situation is, and saying who the actors are and what their goals are, and what the problem is that's trying to be solved, and imagine that somehow you can do all of that before making judgments about who's right or wrong, or what should be done, where all you did was let someone sort of describe the scene, and they were given that the opportunity to describe the scene, so they picked their vocabulary and said, well, this person is violating that person's human rights, and this person is violating that person's human rights, and this person is protecting that person's human rights, and now let's solve the problem together. You've already given away the opportunity to impose a perspective that is founded in a system of value judgments that's compatible with Torah once you're already participating in that different vocabulary system for talking about what's going on. And that doesn't mean, you never kind of speak someone else's language in order to get a sense of what they're saying, but it does mean that there must be an insistence, someone who's trying to understand the world in the terms that Torah sees it in, an insistence in trying to give a characterization of the situation that isn't reaching outside of Torah for, let's say, terms and vocabulary to characterize what's going on, without doing so with extreme care and without doing so, while realizing that you can very easily cede the argument and sort of give away the farm, so to speak, simply by allowing your interlocutor to define the terms of the debate and be given free rein to determine the outcome of the argument with their control over the definitions of what is and what isn't.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.